Hi everyone, it's John. Happy Tuesday. I wanted to talk about a book today by a writer who I think is sort of criminally underread in the United States. And I think there's a good reason why a lot of Americans, everyone, but especially Americans, should be reading him. And it is Washington Irving. And the book I'm talking about is it's this particular Penguin Classics edition, which they are calling The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Other Stories. It is exactly the same set of stories which Washington Irving himself published under as a book called The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crown, Gentleman. That's how he published them. I don't know why they didn't want to publish them under that name. Maybe they thought that people would be thrown off by seeing something called by Geoffrey Crown Gentleman published by Washington Irving. That might be confusing for people buying the book, but that was the original title. And like the title says, this is the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which is by far the longest piece in the book, and another 33 for a total of 34 of short stories, sketches, observations, cultural musings, things like that. And comes in at about 300 pages or so, and is just a wide variety of different kinds of writing. Focused on the fictional, but there are some aspects of I'll get into the different kinds. I think kind of like Jane Austen, it seems like Washington Irving suffers the same fate. Insofar, I think he's really considered to belong to a later time than he actually belonged to. When he's read it all, and pretty much all we read by him, it seems like these days, is Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. He's kind of lumped in with writers like Hawthorne and Melville and Emerson as far as being their contemporaries. But he really belongs to an earlier generation. He's a contemporary of James Fenimore Cooper. And he's really one of the first writers to be taken seriously in the United States as a writer, and one of the first writers to be able to make a living as a writer without having to supplement it by doing too many other things. This was at a time when Europe was really seen as the sole repository of real literature in the world, and that Americans were just sort of seen as upstarts, these literary arrivistes who were trying to catch up to the European greats. And it was, many people may not call Washington Irving today a great writer, but he was one of those first writers that was really feeling his tentacles around him and figuring out, how can I make American writing American writing? How can I make this effort, this task that I've carved out for myself, a truly American pursuit? And I think you can see that process happening as you read Washington Irving's stories. While Irving did write many full-length books, including a 5-volume biography of George Washington, to whom he was actually introduced as a young boy by his mother and named after. Presented here is a series of 34 short stories, tales, and sketches, again, originally published under the name The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crown Gentleman, a name that Irving would use for the rest of his literary career. It was published at the same time in 1820 in England and the United States, where he was actually living in England when it was published. Like I said, the collection includes Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, that he attributes to another person. So it's interesting how how complex and weird these early writers like to contribute, attribute their stories to other imaginary people. But he says that the Legend of Sleepy Hollow is written by this guy named Dietrich Knickerbocker, which is actually where we get the word Knickerbockers from. And Knickerbocker was just a completely made up historian, a made up personality, and he is a Dutch historian. I think he's also associated with some of the other histories that Washington Irving wrote. He might be in the history of New York and some of those other books. Washington Irving wrote a lot, and some of his stuff has already come out in the Library of America. If anyone is familiar with those volumes, he has 2 or 3 whole volumes all to himself in the Library of America series. The tone and the range of the stories in here really runs the gamut from astute observation to kind of the maudlin and overly sweet sentimentality to straight out self-deprecatory mockery and satire. The time Irving spent in England really shines through in these books. Included in here is a piece on English funerary traditions, a short series of sketches about a Christmas spent with an English family. It's unclear whether he actually spent it or it's just a fictional account of him spending that time with them. And a character sketch of the nature enthusiast Isaac Walton, who wrote in the 17th century a very popular book on fishing called The Complete Angler. The best pieces, though, don't even try to take the form of fiction at all, but they look much more like a kind of literary reportage. His commentary on the growing disdain that European writers and European literature had for American writers, and vice versa, is one of those, as is a piece on bookmaking and a ruminative tour around Westminster Abbey. They all have that kind of reportage, journalistic feel. But I think Irving is really a writer that we should all go back and read occasionally. Even above and beyond Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, reading him really gives you a sense of where American literature was and where it was going 200 years ago. They highlight the really tremendous influences that Irving had on writers like Hawthorne and Poe and even Melville. And after 200 years of little more than mimicking the European classics, reading Washington Irving gives you a sense of the fuller vistas of American literary potential. And here we are, I think these little stories and sketches say, making our first baby steps towards something strange and new, something we call American. It's interesting to see literature morph into something uniquely and recognizably European in voice to something uniquely and recognizably American in voice. And when you read Washington Irving, you can actually see that change happening before your eyes in real time. It's a real treat. If you've never read him, and like I said, if you've only read those 2 stories, pick up this book or pick up a history that he wrote. They're sort of fanciful, but this was really pleasurable. And because of it, I bought those other 2 or 3 Library of America volumes, and I'll eventually get around to reading and reviewing those. But if you have any comments about him, please share, leave them below, and I will see you next week. Bye, everyone.